first of itself gets dissolved, because then who is the subject?
The India's Most Trusted Brand of the Year Awards 2024 with the first award category, which is Best UGC NET JRF English Coaching in Delhi by Vineet Pandey. It goes to Professor Vineet Pandey.
दिल्ली में सीएमपी द्वारा दूसरा अंतर्राष्ट्रीय सम्मेलन डॉक्टर दीक्षा त्रिपाठी ने थैनेटोपॉलिटिक्स पर चर्चा की।
Tell you something really interesting, that this is the first ever conference in India about thanatopolitics, and you are the first people who are going to be privileged enough to engage in such an enlightening dialogue. Just give yourself a huge round of applause for this.
We are also delighted to be joined by the parents of our founder. Let us give them a round of applause again. And our other distinguished guests also have joined us.
Now, let's go on to welcome Professor Saugata Bhaduri, who's a professor in the Center of English Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. His research interest spans the literary and cultural history of colonial Bengal, contemporary literary and cultural theory, popular cultural translation, and comparative literature. Recently, he has served as an Erich Auerbach Visiting Chair of World Literature at George August University, Göttingen, Germany. We would like to have your presence and your enlightening word on the dais, sir. Yeah. Just give him a huge round of applause.
Let us welcome Bhaduri, sir.
Thank you, Diksha, for having me over and thinking of this particular topic. So as Diksha has already pointed out some of the most, let's say, basic ideas behind thanatopolitics, one must note that how the shift from biopolitics, and which really had governed our understanding of how human lives get led, and which Foucault and thereafter Agamben would have fundamentally theorized, how from biopolitics this shift to thanatopolitics, or the shift to thinking about how death gets worked out, how death needs to be thought of, or how the politics of death needs to be theorized, is indeed the primary shift that we have to begin with in trying to understand thanatopolitics. And this difference, I mean, so having talked about death, one thing that is also to be marked, and therefore before I begin my real talk, which is the difference between necropolitics and thanatopolitics, that also has to be marked out, because they are not exactly conflatable. Indeed, thinking about the death includes thinking about death, but thinking about dead, because necro literally talks about the dead people or dead bodies, whereas thanatos refers to death in itself. So thinking about dead bodies or who are to die, and thinking about death itself might have to be, so necropolitics and thanatopolitics might have to be separated a bit. But more importantly, there are two things to be pointed out. First of all, why is it that we have, or when is it that we have started thinking again about death? When is it that we move from thinking of biopolitics to thanatopolitics? And more importantly, since this particular conference is not on thanatopolitics in itself, but on the post-human angle in thanatopolitics, therefore what one has to reflect on is, because talking about human deaths or human dead bodies, necropolitics thought of only in anthropic terms, that will not serve the purpose of this particular conference, since this particular conference tries to connect thanatopolitics to the post-human. So indeed, that also has to be thought about as to how thinking about death exits thinking about only human deaths, or thinking about only death as it concerns human beings, to thinking about death in post-humanistic terms. So these are the two things that I would begin with. So till, let's say, the Renaissance, because of death being quite ubiquitous, death thought was present very much in our philosophy. So our philosophers or our theologians would continuously think about death. However, from the Renaissance onwards, with the setting in of humanism, we find that somehow life starts taking the center stage. And life-affirming philosophies or life-exploring philosophies, and humanism itself becomes one of the cornerstones of that. That becomes our mainstay, leading right up to Foucault's theorization, therefore, within after the Renaissance and within the Enlightenment of biopolitics, and thereafter also of biopolitics. However, and this continues till very much till Nietzsche at the very least. So middling end of 19th century, Nietzsche's idea of joyful affirmation of life, that itself in a way also marks this continuity of thinking about life rather than thinking about death. But from the end of the 19th century, we find, probably because of certain, let's say, shifts, and thereafter in the war years, particularly the interwar years, death again becomes ubiquitous around us. Death again starts surrounding us. Of course, the Spanish flu, and we'll come to the latest pandemic in a minute, but death again starts becoming ubiquitous from the end of the 19th century onwards, and we find once again death, or thinking about death, entering majorly into canonical thought, and starting right from Freud, for instance. So Freud would have talked about, Freud actually never used the word thanatos. It's only in the English translations and in the, let's say, Freudiana, the mode in which we approach Freud, the word thanatos always emerges vis-a-vis eros, but he used the word Todetrieb, which means death drive. So death drive is what he talks about. But indeed, Freud directly starts talking about, in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, he starts talking about death drive being one of those major instincts in us, which propels us towards what? I'll actually briefly get back to Freud in a few more minutes, but driving us towards what? And herein Freud is very clear. So what does Todetrieb do? What does death drive do? What does thanatos, if we use the common term that we associate with Freud, though he never used the term, what does that do? So that continuously drives us towards becoming at one with the inorganic world. Here Freud is very clear. Freud uses this phrase in as many terms. So the instinct in us that drives us towards becoming at one with the inorganic world. So there is an instinct in us which tries to precisely, and one already sees therefore the idea of the post-human entering. So death drive itself is a desire in us to become at one with what lies outside of the scope of the human, what lies in the inorganic world. But then Freud would have indeed thought about death, but Heidegger would have thought about death much more majorly, because for Heidegger, as we would know, death is precisely that particular moment where the real uncovering of the self happens, and death being that moment towards which our entire life is oriented. So death having become central to thought rather than life. So through the likes of Freud, through the likes of Heidegger. But one can argue, so Freud's argument towards we becoming at one with the inorganic world notwithstanding, one may argue that both Freud and Heidegger probably think of death. So they indeed think of death, but that is, and therefore indeed probably sow the seeds of Thanatopolitics, though the term may have been coined much later, but their thought is probably a bit too anthropic still. Because ultimately Freud, even if he was talking about being at one with the inorganic world, he's talking about human drives. It is the human being that is still the center of his general, let's say, thanatophilosophy, his general thinking of death. And for Heidegger, of course, it's very clear, because it's purely anthropic, because ultimately it is the revelation of, it's the aletheia of the true human self, the true anthropic self, that death somehow ultimately brings in. And therefore, it's not really a post-human thinking or a more than human thinking of death, but a very anthropic thinking of death. And wherein perhaps more recent events have brought in a more distinct post-human turn towards thinking about death. and wherein, just to point out a few things which are happening around us as we are talking, wherein precisely death does not get thought about only in life, in terms of life, but death gets thought about necessarily of human life, but death gets thought about necessarily in posthumanist terms. And what are they? First of all, the genocides around us. They fundamentally, and already Diksha referred to a few of them, what is happening in Palestine as we talk, the indefinite number of fundamentalism, sectarianism, communalisms that plague our world, including our own country. So they point out an inhuman turn in the human beings themselves, where we have probably lost what is humane in us. So death not only comes as human death, but as a symptom of inhumanism, of inhumanity, of us having become inhumane. But that is one example. Second, of course, the pandemic itself, and which again brings death so close to us in the recent years that once again we have started thinking about death. And pandemic indeed becomes a reality. And most of the epidemics and pandemics in recent years have emerged out of interspecies entanglements, because you can name whatever epidemic you want to, right from AIDS to mad cow disease to MERS, SARS, etc., swine flu. So all somehow emerge out of interspecies entanglements, including our current pandemic. So once again, death becomes ubiquitous around us, but not only in terms of human beings, but rather, and that was the second point that I made, rather in terms of interspecies entanglements. Third, a more, let's say, profound death that is happening around us, which is in terms of, let's say, environmental disasters. Even just a couple of weeks back, the kind of floods that have happened in Himachal, etc., leading to many deaths. So deaths happening all around us, but not necessarily centered around the human subject, but due to environmental disasters, due to precisely those non-human agents around us who somehow also become major players in death. And fourthly, and finally, in terms of this series of why death, of course, becomes pertinent to us, but death in post-humanist terms is, of course, multi-species extinction, species extinction per se. So the way dying is happening all around us, not only in terms of human beings dying, but entire species becoming extinct, and continuously global extinction making us aware of what is necessarily beyond the human or more than human. So death not being confined only to the human beings. So mass extinctions themselves. So this consciousness of death, the consciousness of death that we have now around us, is therefore not just anthropocentric, because it concerns, on the contrary, being inhuman. It concerns, on the contrary, being trans-species or having been led from trans-species entanglements, being, on the contrary, conscious of environmental disasters, and being, again, at a fourth level, as I said, being conscious of mass species extinctions, not just human death. And therefore, today, if we talk about Thanatopolitics, it necessarily has to take on a post-human turn, because death is no more confined only to an understanding of human deaths or human-caused deaths. But one thing is that if we think about death only in pessimistic terms, so as we have been so far talking, so death is indeed something that is bad. Death is something that is happening to all of us, and we need to be really, really wary of it in terms of the Thanatopolitics involved therein, in terms of the necropolitics involved therein. Then probably we are having too paranoid a take on death. And as we do know, maybe paranoid readings, even of death, even of Thanatopolitics, doesn't lead us very far. It's one thing to probably lament that there is Thanatopolitics all around us, there is this politics of death, there are programs which are making us die. It's one thing to be pessimistic about it, it's one thing to be paranoid about it, but that doesn't lead us anywhere. So could we have a reparative reading of death? Could we have a reading of Thanatopolitics, a reading of Thanatos, a reading of death itself, that rather than only contributing to a hermeneutics of suspicion, only contributing to a paranoid reading of death as something bad, can we have a reparative reading of death as a means of regeneration, death as a means of creation, where Thanatopolitics in a way leads to Thanatopoiesis, or death as creation. Poiesis, as you'd know, I mean, of course, one can derive Thanatopoetic directly from it and connect to, let's say, literary and cultural studies. But Thanatopoiesis, poiesis being used in its original Greek sense, that of creation. So can death be thought of as something that is creative, death as a means of regeneration? And can, therefore, Thanatopolitics lead to Thanatopoiesis, or our thinking of death in post-human terms? Because that is what is of pertinence to us here today. Can a post-human take on Thanatopolitics lead us, instead of a mere paranoid reading of death, to a more reparative reading of creation, of Thanatopoiesis itself? Now, this term Thanatopoiesis was originally coined by a particular theologian and philosopher called Robert Detweiler. But that's quite besides the point. In 1993, the essay was published in 1994, where he talked about Thanatopoiesis, death becoming a means of regeneration, death becoming a means of creation. But Robert Detweiler is an incidental reference here. So death not being a cessation, but death being a means of regeneration. That is exactly what I'm talking about. And that is where a post-humanistic contribution to Thanatopolitics can work itself out, where death does not become an end, and therefore something that we have to be paranoid about, scared about, that we are all going extinct, we are all dying, but rather death as a means of regeneration. That is exactly what I would like to talk about. Now, this is not in itself a new idea, because indeed talking about regeneration after death is age-old. So we have the idea of reincarnation, for instance. So how someone gets born in one's next life as something else, as someone else. We have also stories of people remembering previous births. So let's say regeneration after death, one getting life again after death. So that is always there, I mean, reincarnation. But reincarnations are also often too anthropic. Just like earlier I had talked about Freud's and Heidegger's concept of death probably being a little too anthropic, because if you are reborn again as a human being, then of course death is not the end. Death leads to regeneration, and our thinking of death also has this promise of creation, but it is too anthropic a creation, because you get reincarnated as another human being. But that is not the only model of reincarnation or regeneration that we have. So both in, let's say, Indic philosophies and in Greek philosophies, we have the idea of a transmigration of souls. We have the idea of regeneration, and not anthropic regeneration. Of course, as we know, in Kathopanishad, the major phrase that we hear all the time in Kathopanishad 1.2.18, so that is book 1, chapter 2, verse 18, which also gets reproduced in Gita as in chapter 2, verse 20, but Gita comes much later. So Gita actually reproduces the phrase from Kathopanishad. As we know, na hanyate hanyamane sharire. So our body dies, but it doesn't die. It itself doesn't. So death is not a cessation. On the contrary, the body may die, but it lives on. Similarly, in Greek thought also, and majorly, and since Republic is something that all of you have read, so Republic incidentally ends. I mean, if you have read Republic from Plato's Republic from cover to cover, so the end of Republic, so the very last book, 10th book, actually ends. So the whole volume of Republic ends with this story of this particular person called E-R-R, who is a general, who is a soldier basically. So he dies, and he kind of miraculously returns back from death after 12 days. And he narrates this story of how he saw, so I mean this becomes very important, how he saw dead souls, some of them having become birds, some of them having become animals, and again animals having become human beings. Even in the Indian cosmological mode, so soul, the transmigration of souls, so transmigration of souls is called metempsychosis in Greek, as you would know. So transmigration of souls does not happen necessarily from human form to human form, as reincarnation is, but rather transmigration of souls can take other than human forms. So in the mythological universes of both Indic philosophical modes of understanding transmigration of souls, and in the Greek mode of the Western philosophical mode of understanding transmigration of souls, we find the possibility of human beings after death taking on forms that are otherwise than human. You can be reincarnated as a bird, bird, you can be reincarnated as an animal, as any other animal, etc., etc. But is this good enough in proposing thanatopoiesis, the kind of thanatopoiesis that I was talking about? So what I meant to say was there is already, from time immemorial, there are already models which try to suggest that death is not an end, death is a means to regeneration. But is that, and there is a post-human connect to it also, it's posthumous as well as posthuman, because posthumous means after death. So I'm basically trying to talk about posthumous ontologies, as you must understand. So the models of regeneration and reincarnation that I talked about from both Indic and Western philosophical systems, they are indeed both posthumous because they talk about life after death, and they're posthuman because both of them talk about human beings being born as other animals, other birds, etc., etc. But is that good enough? Is that really a solid theory of understanding death? Probably not, and for two reasons. First of all, even the principle of na hanyate, it undercuts the principle of death itself. Because what does it say? So the body dies, but it does not die. So there is a negation of death. There is a denial of death. So in a true thanatopoiesis, there cannot be a denial of death, because thanatopoiesis to begin with must foreground the idea of death. So a principle like na hanyate, which denies death, at least of the soul, already therefore is contra thanatos. It's contra death. But that is just one aspect. The second aspect is that of nirvana, of moksha. And herein I go back to Freud, because again in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, Freud coins this wonderful phrase nirvana principle. In fact, Freud talks at length about nirvana principle. It's one of the more important theoretical concepts of Freud, nirvana principle, in as many words. I mean, nirvana principle spelled as nirvana principle. So the point being that this entire transmigration of souls philosophy, it however suggests that you can exit this recycling. So the souls will get recycled only till a certain extent, but thereafter you can get nirvana. In fact, in Freud's idea of Toda-Trieb that I talked about, death drive, the whole idea of the human being wanting to become at one with inorganic matter, therein also, according to Freud, what works is nirvana principle, the idea of getting out of this chain of death. So since both Greek metempsychosis and the Indian notion of recycling of souls also has the possibility of an exit, it is at the end of the day something that does not get contained within a sustained philosophy of death. Because on the contrary, it suggests that at some point of time this recycling will cease. And you will probably gain moksha, you will probably gain nirvana, you will probably exit this cycle of life and death. So on both these counts, therefore, the Indic theory of transmigration of souls as well as the Greek theory of transmigration of souls, including Freud's own idea of the nirvana principle, they do not really count as thanatopoietic. They do not really count as thanatopoiesis for the simple reason there is a denial of death, first of all, and there is also a cessation of recycling, because at some point of time you can have a way out. And therefore, if at all we need to talk about, so we have to look elsewhere perhaps. We have to look probably in some, for our posthumous thanatopoiesis, we probably have to look elsewhere and exactly to the very registers that I had earlier talked about, which is the death of the humane that I talked about, genocide, etc. So you would remember the coordinates that I talked about earlier as to why at all death has become so ubiquitous. So maybe rather than resting with the idea of thanatopoiesis becoming fulfilled through a classical Greek or classical Indian philosophy, we may have to look elsewhere in more fertile post-human grounds. So let us begin with the idea of the inhumane, so genocides that we were talking about. Now what one must understand is that on the one hand, indeed this is a post-human domain, because as I said, genocides entail someone having become inhuman, someone having become less than human, otherwise than human, having lost its humaneness. But as we must understand, genocides themselves might also, so the deaths that occur therein might also lead to the spirit of revolution, to the spirit of resistance, a thanatopoietic act where death does not mean the, let's say, to be despaired, to be felt sad about end of life as it is. But on the contrary, deaths themselves can lead, rekindle the light of revolution, the fire of resistance, and therefore almost thanatopoetically build up the possibility. So martyrs, as we understand, the spirit of the martyr, which will even after death light on, ignite so many other revolutionary individuals, or even living on in memory, so to say. So the persistence in memory after death, especially in cases of genocide, etc. And one may say that, well, if we are talking about only human revolutionaries, or we are talking about only human memory, then again one is being too anthropic. So this particular example of mine of thanatopoiesis, where death is not a cessation, death actually rekindles new thought. The example that I gave could be thought of as too anthropic, but then memorials, as we must understand, are not only restricted to the organic, only restricted to human beings. There are inorganic memorials also, memorials made of stones, bricks, memorials which are otherwise than human. I mean, most memorials are. So memorials are themselves inorganic. So the living on, so to say, through memorials, so that is one thing that we must also keep in mind. So inorganic matter becoming the bearer in a thanatopoetic way of a living on of a memory even after death. And in a post-human context, because I was talking precisely about that inhuman situation of genocide, of fundamentalism, of communalism, etc., etc. Second, the second post-human mode of thanatopoiesis, or living on after death, is that of the undead. So the idea of ghosts, specters. So the human being ceases to live, but posthumously lives on, not as a human subject anymore, not even as in my previous example I gave of having rekindled other human minds or having lived on in other human minds, but as a spectral presence around us. We are all aware of ghosts. We are all of the undead itself, zombies, so to say, ghosts, spirits, specters, and the entire theory of hauntology, the idea of how what haunts us itself becomes this radical possibility, as traces the radical possibility of probably reparatively creating things anew. So you're all aware of hauntology. I need not spend much time on it. So a second instance of a truly post-human thanatopoiesis, a post-human, posthumous becoming after death, of creation beyond death, could be of the hauntological possibility of specters, how traces themselves, particularly in posthumous entities like ghosts, specters, etc., how they can lead us on towards creativity. A third, again, post-human instance of parts of us living on, parts of us actually continuing to live even after our death, again in a very post-human context, could obviously be the idea of organ transplants, prostheses, etc., where maybe I, having donated my cornea, so I may have died, and therefore, however, death, rather than being this cause of despair, a part of me lives on and on and on. And mind you, as far as organ transplants are concerned, or even inorganic transplants to prostheses, and therefore us being drawn into this thanatopoetic possibility, which is automatically post-human in nature, we are not only restricted to human organs being donated, because more and more we are having, let's say, pig aortas being transplanted in human bodies, and there can come a day, because if it's only a one-way transaction, then it doesn't work out. There can come a day when maybe a human organ can be transplanted in a pig or a cow. But anyway, the possibility of a part of me living on beyond death, the thanatopoetic possibility of us going beyond the paranoia of death. But that is just one instance. Let me now move on to the final instance, and which is really the most profound instance of how death is not something to despair about. Death is not something that brings an end to everything. On the contrary, death is a hopeful thing. Death is something that leads on to creativity, and wherein, and with which, with a brief elaboration of which I would end my talk, is of course Donna Haraway's elaborate theorization of the idea of humicities. So again, so I have already used the term posthuman, posthumous already in my talk so much. So how the posthumous, or what lies after death, or being after death, is connected to the posthuman. But Donna Haraway, as you'd know, she brings in this idea of humicities itself, humus. Humus, as we know, is after death when you rot, when organic matter becomes part of the earth and ends up fertilizing earth. And as Donna Haraway very, very nicely says, that she believes that humanities has to evolve into humicities. Humanities has to evolve, the anthropic code of humanities has to evolve into us being able to think of dead matter as fertilizing earth. And she also talks about composting in a major way, as you do know, compost. At the end of the day, we are all composed. We human beings, as well as our otherwise than human co-partners in this world, all organic matter on this world, at the end of the day, all of us will die. And all of us will disintegrate and decompose and become part of the earth. But having become that, what does compost do? What does humus do? So humus and compost essentially fertilize the earth. Humus, so we may be dead someday, we'll all die someday. But as dead bodies, as compost, as humus, we end up fertilizing new species who will come up, new species who will populate the earth, new life forms who will grow, having in a way nourished themselves from our own dead remains. And therein, therefore, as Donna Haraway also builds up this huge ethics through her idea of humicities and through her idea of compost. So there is nothing to really despair about species extinctions. There is nothing really to in fact, despairing about death is shallow ecology. So us despairing that, well, look what kind of environmental disasters are happening all around us. The world is going to be destroyed. Our species will become extinct. All species are becoming extinct. It's really a very sad situation. And therefore, let's do something about it. Let's save humankind. Let's save other species. That's shallow ecological. A more deep ecological understanding of the situation would be that, of course, there have been so many mass extinctions in the long history of this world. There have always been, so dinosaurs became extinct, and now as fossils, as posthumous entities, they provide us with fossil fuels, and not they necessarily, but some fossils or the other. So our current world runs its energy on what are the composted remains of some species which had gone extinct a few million years back. Similarly, we will also die. This particular life that currently is there on Earth will indeed get extinct. But rather than getting alarmed about the thanatopolitics of it, let's think of how it is thanatopoetic in nature. How our death in turn will fertilize this Earth. And that is a deep ecological thought, where death, our current extinction, will actually be a contribution towards later life forms to emerge. Some million years down the line, this world will again sprout new life forms, and all because we can become compost, we can become humus, and this displacement of our anthropocentric humanities unto a notion of humicities, this displacement of the post-human unto the posthumous, this displacement of all kind of posts with the idea of compost might indeed lead, therefore, to a thanatopoetic, creative, from the despair of thanatopolitics to the welcoming of death. So death, let us be welcoming of death, or not despair, not necessarily welcoming, but not despair at death, because death is not the end of life. Death, on the contrary, will only provide thanatopoetically and in a post-human way to new life forms to emerge. And therefore, from humanities to humicities is precisely the thanatopoetic turn that I want to close my thoughts with. And also this regeneration, so regeneration itself, so to say, and rather than only in a paranoid manner averting death. So in a way, it's also like the ship of Theseus. So our entire world in its long history is like this ship of Theseus, where every part might get replaced time to time, but at the end of the day, a ship still, and that as you know is a thought experiment. Is it the same ship or is it not the same ship? But nevertheless, so the fact that each part of us will die someday, but that it will be replaced by something else, and to lead on to new leases of the ship still continuing to be there. This earth that we together share as multiple species will continue to be there. That is the thanatopoetic promise with which I would like to leave this particular podium. So let us, when we are thinking about thanatopolitics from a post-humanist angle, we have to rather talk about the posthumous possibilities of humicities and thanatopoiesis rather than the paranoid despairing over the politics of death, welcoming the cultivable possibilities of death being connected to regeneration and recreation. So thank you very much for your patience.